And welcome back to Otaku No Video. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Here today with a primer on the anime studio Gainax. This is a studio that's been around for quite a while and deserves some mention and description. This is going to be divided into several different videos, starting today with the very early days of Gainax, back before you probably thought they even existed, back in the 70s and 80s. Gainax was formed by a couple of otaku, actually, back when otaku really were just beginning to form in Japan. So Toshio Okada, Hideaki Anno, and a bunch of others all decided, well, they were all in college together, they were all buds. Anno not so much, but he was sort of on the periphery. But a bunch of these guys were all in college, they were all watching anime and reading manga back in the late 70s. And they watched things like Original Mobile Suit Gundam when it aired on television in 1979. And they were part of that initial group of science fiction and fantasy fans. And so they were big into those circles. And Gainax first formed in terms of that core group as a bunch of people who started going to conventions and found the conventions very poorly run. And they decided they could do their own convention better than a lot of the conventions that were being run at that time. So they got together and started doing several sci-fi conventions. And to their surprise, they were very good at doing this. They organized several conventions over the 80s. And they did two different kinds of conventions. They did conventions for fans, and they also did industry conventions. And we'll get to that in a minute about why that was important. And as they started doing these conventions, they realized what would be fun would be to, besides organizing everything else, make the conventions more celebrations of science fiction and anime and so forth, and really do things that were unique. So the original founders decided to go and find folks who could actually make animations. They wanted to make opening animations for the con. So you come to the con, come to opening ceremonies, and see an original animation just for the con. And they found Hideaki Anno, amongst others, who was a rising talent in the animation world. He was an actual animator who'd worked on Nausicaa, the Valley of Wind, and other things. And they got him to essentially supervise animation on what was called then the Daikon 3 animation. Now, what's important about the Daikon 3 animation is that it was this huge celebration of science fiction. Not just anime, but also science fiction in general. And it was pretty crude, but at least it showed that amateurs could make animation using the same techniques that folks in the actual industry were using. Cell animation, hand-painted backgrounds, all that stuff. They had the advantage that there was no dialogue in it. It was just a song set to animation. But it was remarkable, and it got enough positive reaction from fans and critics that they decided to make a second animation for Daikon 4. Now, what is this whole Daikon thing? It's very complicated because of how the Japanese language works, but it's basically a big science fiction convention in Japan that those folks were basically organizing. Think of it like a Worldcon over here, or a DragonCon, big sci-fi convention. But of course over there it celebrates anime and manga and so forth, as well as general sci-fi. So they decided to do that, and they made the Daikon 4 animation. Now this became a legendary piece of animation. Up until the modern day, people still refer to the Daikon 4 animation. Very fluid animation, very good, and it contains references and parodies of a huge swath of science fiction and fantasy things. There's this one sequence which pans across literally thousands of characters from American comics, Japanese comics, anime, manga, American science fiction. There are parody sequences where the Yamato battles the Starship Enterprise and all this crazy stuff. It's really fun. And it was a couple minutes long, using the Electric Light Orchestras, I don't know why that's hard to say, their song Twilight, which would then become sort of a geek byword within the Japanese anime community. Anyway, so Daikon 4 was really interesting, and it really got a lot of people going. A lot of apocalyptic imagery, and had some very iconic imagery relating to explosions. If you've ever seen an anime music video which shows like animated shock waves of what looks like an atomic bomb going, that's probably from Daikon 4. It will never see the light of day legally because there are so many copyrighted characters included in it that there's no way of getting sign-off on all of those characters. Meanwhile, those folks who were going to form and were forming what was essentially Gainax were also getting into the marketing side of things because they started getting into what are called garage kits, which were these model kits. So you'd have a particular character from an anime, whatever, and you'd be able to make them your own out of like resin kits, things like that. So they would both make models and also sell the equipment for making models themselves. And this turned into big business, at least by their standards. They ended up opening a store called General Products. That's actually a geeky sci-fi reference to a Larry Niven novel, or series of novels. And General Products was this store that that the Gainax folks had and ran for a very long time. It was a very successful store that sold model kits and garage kits, and all sorts of other anime and manga paraphernalia. And that really kept them afloat for a long time. Meanwhile, they had a lot of, through these conventions, they had a lot of dealings with various companies. And I think it was Bandai who originally came to them and said, we have this money that's been left over from various productions, and we would, and they were going to go to anime, those projects were canceled. Would you be interested in making a film, now that we've seen Daikon 4 and know that you can find the people to do the animation, would you like to make like an animated OVA or a film or something? We kind of have the money sitting around for that. So the Gainax folks came together and they decided to make a movie called The Wings of Honneamise. Now, Honneamise was a landmark anime film for being science fiction. It was, the world doesn't look like a traditional anime or manga world. Very original. The money looks different. The costumes look different. Housing looks different. All sorts of things about this world are original and distinctive. But it all works. It's not just random stuff thrown together. It feels like a homogeneous world. And it tells the story of this other world's first space program. And about sort of the characters involved in that and the weird scientists. And this is not a spoiler, but it ends with this very artsy-fartsy ending. If you've seen the end of Evangelion, as in the end of the TV show as well as the movie, it's that kind of a thing. And Honneamise is, and I keep using the word art, it is a work of art. It is not otaku pandering. It is meant to be a serious work of science fiction. And it definitely works that way. It's not for everybody, but it's this really impressive work. And when it came out, folks were like, who are these Gainax people and what are they doing? This is original. Wow. So that got them a lot of attention. And as a result, and because it did so well, they decided to go and make an anime O.AV called Aim for the Top Gunbuster, or Tapo Norai Gunbuster. Now, the interesting thing about Gunbuster is that it is more about, it is more traditional anime, but made by science fiction fans who really think through the consequences of a lot of these science fiction premises. For example, in this world, in order to go to travel interstellarly, you have the problem of expanding time. So, if you go from here to here, time passes in the real world. It doesn't pass for you. So there's a wonderful sequence, and again, this is not a spoiler, but there's a wonderful sequence, wonderful little scene later in the Gunbuster OVA where the main character has traveled interstellar to an interstellar location, traveled back to Earth, and the people she used to know are now significantly older than they were before. And she meets up with a friend of hers who's now, I think 5 or 10 years older than she is, and now has a child and all sorts of stuff. And there's this very poignant aspect to the fact that the main character who has the burden of there's an alien race attacking, duh. She has to, help, duh. But it's the burden of her having to do this and leaving her friends behind in a very real way that she ends up being in a very different place, which is very interesting. So the first half or so of Gunbuster is this rather traditional anime story about a teenage girl who's training and is sort of last in her class kind of stuff. And then it builds into more of a big science fiction ending, but with these aspects of really thinking through the consequences, which is very, very cool. And that's one of the reasons that folks got interested in Gainax, is that this was an anime that appealed more to otaku on a more anime level, whereas Honneamise was more of an art film. This was more of an actual anime work, but that had more thought put into it. And this got them enough notoriety that they went to, I think it was NHK at the time. Anyway, a TV studio, they were talking to a TV studio, who said, we have this anime TV story idea that was presented to us, and we decided to pass on it at the time, but now we kind of want to do it. The original person behind it doesn't want to, you know, is now busy with other stuff. Would you be interested in taking it over? Fortunately, this guy who's gone on to other things, his name was Hayao Miyazaki. Yeah, that guy. And his idea was for this TV series called Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water. And if you've ever seen Miyazaki works, you'll think, aha, Nadia looks like a Ghibli work. That's why. And Nadia is set in this sort of turn-of-the-century world of early airplanes, things like that, with an African girl who gets involved with a boy, and they have this big rollicking adventure, and there's a big submarine, and a guy who looks just like Captain Global from across, and all sorts of stuff like that. So the advantage of this is that, again, it wasn't originally Gainax's idea, and as a result, it had more of a crowd-pleasing, broad audience appeal. It was much more family-friendly than Honneamise or Gunbuster. Nadia feels like a Ghibli film. It's this sweet story in a lot of ways, with a lot of action-adventure, things like that, and some definitely scary sequences. But that series, because it aired on TV, was what really got the public interested in Gainax. The public now knew who Gainax was and knew about the studio beyond just the hardcore otaku market. And that's when Gainax started really, you know, getting interest and getting, you know, attention. And that happened in 1990. In 1991, Gainax went back to doing more one-shot OVAs at a few fairly obscure things. And they also made something called Otaku no Video, which, as you may have guessed, was sort of an inspiration for me. Now, the original Otaku no Video anime is it's actually split into two parts. The first part is a sort of humorous documentary about what it was like to be an otaku in the late 70s, early 80s. What science fiction fandom was like in Japan at that time, and what it was like to be an anime fan when anime still had a popular impression of being for kids. I mean, it wasn't until '79 the Gundam came out and started really transforming popular opinion about that. And even that wasn't popular when it first came out. So this was a huge step forward for otaku in general in terms of documenting what that was like as a series of both animated clips following characters who are very much like the various Gainax personnel, and following and doing these parody documentary clips where they went around and interviewed real otaku about what it was like back then. And they're all Gainax people and so forth and so on. And it's all very much, you know, tongue-in-cheek. The second half of Otaku no Video then is a parody documentary of the founding of Gainax and what Gainax was like. And starting in with garage kits and things like that. Now, it has this completely ridiculous storyline where they end up basically taking over the world. But it's very interesting for that sort of perspective of what founding a company like Gainax was like, and doing something like General Products and making model kits and garage kits and things like that. So I'm rapidly reaching the end of my time for this video. Those are the early years of Gainax and how they were first formed and the first few anime they made that really made an impression on first sort of critical film people with Honneamise, then otaku with Gunbuster, and the general populace with Nadia. And we would see how later on that would become much, much, much bigger than it had been. So stay tuned for the next part.